Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shauna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And Dr. Lisa, have we stopped counting how many times we have gone to Dallas? Have we stopped counting? Have we?
I think we have, yes, yes. Um, Although next month will be a light month for me, but not for you. So,
Not for me. Not for me. A lot of turn and burn moments. So yeah, not for
hmm
me. But
hmm
it's all good. It's all good. I had a sobering wake up call when a person that I follow on Instagram that's really highly motivating at this, very important story about how they kind of turned their lives around and everything. And so they're just really a motivating story. And they said that it's like 70 some days left until the end of the year. And I was like, I don't want to hear that number. So, yeah, it's a tad overwhelming, Lisa, but it's all good. Um, for those of you that have a hard time juggling, whether it's holidays or turning things down, turning things off, whatever, we got a lot that needs to be done before that, including an election, including all kinds of things that we're going to have to experience before December 31st. So here we are. But Lisa, let me jump right in and get us started with a term that I have only recently heard, maybe in the last, 2 months now, usually around debates and around a specific person that I refuse to allow come across my lips to say. But the word is sane washing, sane washing. And so after I looked at a few definitions, because I've been trying to educate myself on what this really means in real time, especially from a journalistic perspective and coverage in the news and so forth, sane washing is defined as an attempt to downplay a person or an idea's radicality, coming from the word radical, to make it more palatable to the general public. So it really does feel like an attempt to make someone or something from a radical perspective seem as if it's being taken out of context and as if they don't truly represent the lion's share of people's thinking. And so for me, I'm still trying to wrap my brain around this because, you know, with this word, first of all, it just took me off guard in general, in regards to the context that we live in here in the US. Mental health could and should be taken very seriously. And so even broaching the word sane in any way, shape, or form was a little bristling and jolting for me. Yet at the same time, Lisa, you and I both on this podcast have talked about whitewashing. We've talked about rainbow washing. We've talked about greenwashing. We've talked about lots of different forms of washing. And so when this one came up, I said, "Ooh, we need to grapple with this a little bit." So I haven't completely gotten my brain wrapped around it, but I thought it would be important for us to bring up, especially during this election season. But Lisa, is this a new word for you as it was for
hmm
me, or is
hmm
it one that you already knew of and you're just seeing it applied in a different way?
Well, the term is new. The what it does is not new because I have been on my
Uh,
soapbox about it, particularly with media coverage. And we are as of the point that you are listening or watching this podcast, we're 2 weeks out from the election. So the um, normalizing of erratic, radical, nonsensical, incoherent, extreme speech, presenting that as totally legit and fine, um, as a means to provide balance between the two primary candidates. That is obviously, I've talked about that ad nauseum on this podcast. Um, so when I saw the term sane washing, yeah, outside of the kind of ableist mental health problematic nature of that, that's it resonated. Yeah.
yeah, and it resonated for me. And I think too, what really is interesting to me is that actually the word palatable. Let's make it seem as if this is okay. Let's make it seem as if this It reminds me, Lisa, when you're trying to portray data, for example, and you have that one outlier that's way, 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 way out there, and you're trying to make it seem as if, no, they actually are part of the data set. No, the hell they ain't. I mean, not a mainstream data set or a mainstream thinking, mainstream approach. That outlier, they're trying to grab that outlier and bring it closer into the rest of the quote unquote normalized perspective, data, information, et cetera, when it's almost impossible to do that, and especially given where we are in the moment where I remember seeing a meme that said something to the effect of, oh, how refreshing it is to actually see two people, even when you don't agree with them, put together coherent sentences, right? So this was, I believe, right after the vice presidential debate where it was like, no, we don't necessarily agree with one or the other, but oh my goodness, a complete coherent sentence.
Mm-hmm.
How refreshing. And I'm thinking to myself,
Right.
the bar has crumbled, okay, in regards to the standard of
Mm-hmm.
communication for people that are to be in leadership of this country. So, anyway, I've been seeing it pop up more and more. And so, yeah, we need to grapple with it a bit more. And what does it mean and what we're willing to accept
Mm-hmm.
in regards to standardizing things that just simply are not standard thinking. So yeah, I'll stop there. But sane washing, y'all, this is one, just continue to pay attention as to when you see it pop up in various platforms of media, because I've now seen it in probably 6 or 7 different
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
platforms. And they don't share necessarily the same political perspective either, which was surprising to me. I was thinking it was going to be
Mm.
solely in one area or another, and it wasn't in a specific political perspective. So
Mm-hmm.
there you have it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're going to transition into phase one, which is going to kind of continue this sane washing piece, which I think we can perhaps, as you problematize the use of the term sane, maybe it's more legitimacy washing, palatable
Mm,
washing,
hmm.
reasonableness washing, right? This
All
the
right.
the idea that something is being smoothed down to seem more appropriate or reasonable, I think is what it is. And as I had said, we're 2 weeks away from the election, and the incoherence is on steroids. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to read a bit. So, The Atlantic, the editor in chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, he publishes a newsletter. And several months ago, he published a newsletter where he talked a little bit about this, but he talked about it in the context of people in journalism. And the damage that they're doing in the way that they're presenting information. And so he said, so I'm just going to read the quote. So he said, in relation to this kind of scrubbing of incoherence for, in particular, the former president's speeches, that people in his industry sometimes succumb to one of the most pernicious biases in journalism, the bias towards coherence. We feel, understandably, that it is our job to make things make sense. But what if the actual story is that politics today makes no sense? It works like this. Trump sounds nuts, but he can't be nuts because he's the presumptive nominee for president of a major party, and no major party would nominate someone who is nuts. Therefore, it is our responsibility to sand down his rhetoric, to identify any kernel of meaning, to make light of his bizarro statements, to rationalize, which is why, after the electric shark speech, much of the coverage revolved around the high temperatures in Las Vegas. The Associated Press headline on a story about the event read this way: Trump complains about his teleprompters at a scorching Las Vegas rally. The New York Times headlined it, In Las Vegas, Trump appeals to local workers and avoids talk of conviction. And CNN's headline, Trump proposes eliminating taxes on tips at Las Vegas campaign rally. Now, what actually happened at that rally, if any of you remember, is some of those things were talked about, but he had a massive soliloquy about whether or not he would prefer to be in a boat and electrocuted by the boat because the engine is in the water, or whether he would want to be attacked by a shark, because there have been multiple shark attacks and they seem to be on the rise. So if given the choice, would he prefer to die by shark attack or electrocution in the water if the boat capsized because the engine is in the water, so surely therefore the water must also be electrified? That was a pretty large substantive piece of his speech, and yet, as demonstrated there by the quote I just read you, nothing was reported. I have another example here of a speech that he gave where it was an appearance at the Economic Club of New York back in September, early September, in which he made a number of ludicrous claims, this Atlantic author says, that included a government efficiency commission created at the suggestion of Elon Musk that would totally eliminate fraud and improper payments within 6 months, thereby saving trillions of dollars. And then he also had a question about what he would do around childcare, like how would he change childcare policy to be more supportive of families. And his response included references to Ivanka Trump, among other things. But this quote here, "I look forward to having no deficits within a fairly short period of time, coupled with the reductions that I told you about on waste and fraud and all of the other things that are going on in our country, because I have to stay with childcare." That was the quote, right? It was absolutely ludicrous, as the author says. And many news outlets reported on that as though he was making sense. So, for example, front page headlines in major newspapers calmly relayed that Trump had proposed some reasonable sounding policies, including Trump backs federal panel on efficiency, or Trump offers confusing plan to pay for U.S. childcare with foreign tariffs, right? So all that to say, Shauna, is what is
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
what is this doing when journalists are refusing to tell it like it is, right? To actually
Mm-hmm.
name that these speeches are long, dragged out, incoherent, unrealistic. Name and add other descriptors as you would like there. I feel like this is dangerous, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, here's the thing. Yes, and not only is it dangerous, but it reminds me of another guy that I really love on Instagram, where he has the simplest social media platform that he's now turned into millions of people, where he will give like a specific phrase, and then at the end of it, he just stares in the camera and says, "Make it make sense." Meaning, it makes no sense. Stop trying to explain it. It's not explainable, right? And so for me, as I'm listening to your great list of examples, for me, if journalists continue to do this through their outlets, through their platforms, I feel like it's literally gaslighting the majority of the country to say, oh my, maybe there's something wrong with me that I don't understand what he said. So it has to make sense. I just don't want to admit that it doesn't make sense to me. So let's continue to contort ourselves and our social media platforms, our journalistic platforms in such a way that it has to make sense. No, it does not have to make sense. And so, given that, I feel like it kind of reminds me of when um, we don't want to admit that something doesn't make sense. We don't want to come off as people that don't understand politics or don't understand diplomacy or any of that. There are just some folks that will say either I don't agree or yeah, that makes complete sense. When we have been searching for a coherent sentence from that man for years. And so, given that it is dangerous, in my opinion, I think it's not only dangerous, but I think what then happens is that it lets, once again, another white man off the hook for not being capable of the role, not being coherent in the role. And again, how many times, Lisa, have we seen this? This is on a beyond macro level. But how many times have you and I seen, even on a micro level, how people around powerful white men contort themselves for their comfort? Because here's the thing, other than, and I think we got a little bit closer during the last presidential debate, but usually most folks don't require him to make sense. Most folks don't call him out and say, you don't make fucking sense when you're saying that people are eating animals in, like everything we talked about during our previous episode, where it made no sense and no one publicly held him accountable. Instead, what you're sharing with me is that US media, except for a few, the majority of US media is willing to contort itself rather than to say to a old white man that he is not coherent and is incapable of leading this country.
Right. Right. It's a cycle that you're pointing out, right? Like then
Mm-hmm.
I'm a reader of that media and I'm like, oh, I don't think
Mm-hmm.
it made sense, but this journalist seems to think it makes sense. So then it's probably me, right? And then that just feeds the cycle. So I really like your point there. Um, and if
Mm-hmm.
you are a journalistic outlet and you are supposed to be reporting on the truth, and I understand the truth can be malleable, but like just tell it like it is, right? Like the New York Times reported on him saying that Biden had siphoned off money from FEMA related to Hurricane Helena, that has devastated parts of North Carolina and other states,
Mm-hmm.
that he was funneling off that money to pay for housing for undocumented immigrants. And the New York Times reported it as a mischaracterization. It's not a mischaracterization, it is a lie. It is something he pulled out of thin air because he can, because folks just say he's mischaracterizing it. I mean, how mild is that, right? That's that sane washing that's happening. Like, a lie is a lie, so say it's a lie. And if you can't use the word lie, say it's an untruth or factually inaccurate, right? I know we talked about that last time about we just want you to say it what it is, but I don't understand this contortion. I mean, I understand it from your point of view, what you're saying, but it just feels like, what are we doing if we don't even have media outlets that can just report on what they heard rather than interpret it and reduce its ridiculousness?
Well, I think what gets interesting is that, yes, I believe it is a ethical issue for journalists and folks in the media. So that's one thing. And at the same time, the aggressiveness of his following also provokes fear in certain people. Let's just be real about it. That it does provoke fear in certain people. And so and I'm not trying to make excuses for any of it. I'm just trying to think through that process of being afraid because you've spent your whole life really working hard to be a really good journalist and you need your job when you need to work, you need to do what you do, and you want to tell the truth, capital T, whatever that looks like, yet at the same time, you know the possible repercussions for doing so, which could yet again affect one's livelihood. So now I'm not saying not to be courageous. I'm very much a fan of being courageous. Yet at the same time, I can understand and still disagree. I still want them to say things are a lie. I still
Yeah.
want them not to sugarcoat things. I still want
Mm-hmm.
journalism to be more direct in regards to how the entire country is experiencing this man. Um, and realize that,
Right.
interesting. How are we using language to continue to contort and make one person feel comfortable
Right.
at the behest of a lot of the country's discomfort?
Yeah,
Mm-mm,
because
mm-mm.
he's going to sue them, right? But they have the truth on their side because there are transcripts of his speeches. So he's not going to get anywhere with libel or defamation or whatever he might do, right? Like, so it's just unreal to me. Anyway,
Well, he can get somewhere. He can get somewhere. Where he's getting is if you are a very small media outlet, or let's say you are a Black media outlet, a brown media outlet, a Native or Indigenous media outlet, some attorney will take the case, because remember, you can sue for damn near anything in this country. They would
Right.
take the case knowing that it's pretty hollow, but the mere process of filing for and against an actual case is enough to bankrupt a small media outlet
Mm.
just to go through that process. So, how far are you going to get? I can tell a lie and keep telling a lie and sue you for saying I didn't tell a lie, and I'm still telling the lie, but I'm just going to make sure I bankrupt you. So, not only can you not function anymore, but you certainly can't call out my lies anymore.
Right, but those small outlets don't have the reach. I'm thinking the ABCs, the CBSs, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic. That's what I'm thinking about, these big, very well funded media outlets who have the reach, right? That's not to say he wouldn't do what you just said, but where I am a media outlet and I have all these resources and a lot of financial backing. So why am I not standing up? And why am I not taking this on, right? Because I can
Mm-hmm,
and I
mm-hmm,
have the power and the privilege to do that. Whereas a small media outlet that you just articulated, they don't have the capacity to do that, right? So I just feel like it's
mm-hmm.
a usurpation. Not a
Yeah,
usurp. Like they're usurping their responsibility. They're stepping
yeah.
away from their responsibility that they have. Like these ABC, I mean, that's owned by
Mm-hmm,
Disney. Like it's enormous. They absolutely have the financial resources to call him out, which they kind of did in that debate to some degree. But
mm-hmm,
that's where I find it frustrating. But
mm-hmm,
um
mm-hmm. Yep,
anyway,
yeah.
let's move on to phase 2 here. Um
Yeah, yeah.
uh
Yeah, I think we have it's so much to say about phase one, because just the word, the application, the outcomes, we'll be living that for at least what, a few more months. Hopefully not much longer. We'll see. Hopefully everybody completes the group assignment if you're here in the US. I've already submitted my mail-in ballot, so I'm tracking mine as we speak. But let's move into phase two. Phase two. Look, I get more emails than a little bit, and this was one that really made me pause as I received the link to a report that's been going on at least, and let's see, since 2015. Um, a report called Women in the Workplace 2024. Key findings and takeaways, and it's a partnership between McKinsey and Company and Lean In, which is the organization that is named after Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In specifically. I won't get into my long rant and tirade about the Lean In book. That's another podcast for another day. But what I did want to get into is some of the data points that the report brought up, which were bittersweet in my mind, Lisa. Like the entire report was bittersweet to me because it did document progress in regard to women and what has occurred over the last few years. And at the same time, they kept using this very specific word, Lisa, of fragile. Like almost every page, the word fragile was there, in that, yes, we're seeing an uptick now, but we know that uptick is probably fragile based on fill in the blank, right? And so, despite the progress that they've documented, they're still saying in this report that it could take almost 50 years to reach parity for women in corporate America. And so, based on the current pace of progress, it'll take about 22 years to reach parity for white women. That's a distinction that isn't always there. Usually they lump us together. 22 years to reach parity for white women, and more than twice as long for women of color, right? And we're not just talking about take home pay. We're talking about the wraparound policies around these women that hopefully encourage them to stay on in corporate America, make the workplace better for them to matriculate in. How many women of color we have in leadership, representation in the C-suite. They break that down as well a number of times in the report. And so, Lisa, how this applies to you and I in many ways, of course, these are our people, obviously, as women. But yet at the same time, you and I do a good bit of training, whether it's inclusion training, whether it's bias training, whether it's allyship work. And again, anyone who may hire us in the future, whenever, I don't want you to be shocked by these numbers. And I don't want you to think that this is how can I say, this is kind of like a bait and switch type situation where we're saying, yay, you need training, but oh, it's not going to be effective. Let me get into it. We already knew some of this, but we'll explain a bit more of the foundation. Yes, there's a rise in inclusion training, right? There's lots of bias training. There's lots of anti-bias training. There's even a lot of allyship training in corporate America. Now, what's interesting, and I'm not surprised by this, but Lisa, I'm interested to hear your reaction. It is not leading to employee action that reflects the training. Now, I can't say that I'm surprised by this at all because why? Lisa, anyone that is a smart trainer that has done this for a bit of time and thinks in systemic ways knows that it could be the best training on the planet. But if it doesn't have the wraparound ecosystem to support it, it doesn't amount to a hill of beans, Lisa. So it's very similar to what we've said, even as we review corporate policies, for example. You have a policy here, don't do this, but then you don't have anything in the policy holding people accountable in case they do or when they do. And so what I usually see here with this training piece that they're talking about in this report is that, yeah, women aren't going to experience employee action or change around them if they don't have policies or accountability to support the training. The training ends up being a great way to throw some money at people like you and I. And as we ask what's going to happen before, during, and after our training, and you have no response, we know it's not going to work because there is no infrastructure to support it, right? So those meaningful changes, they're not going to happen simply as the result of inclusion training, right? And then they go on with more really good data around LGBTQ plus women, for example. More than 1 in 4 LGBTQ plus women feel like they can't talk about their personal lives at work. Young women are 2 times as likely as men to cite their age as a source of unwanted attention at work. Less than half of Latinas and Black women say their manager shows interest in their career advancement. How's that for a sense of belonging, or lack thereof? And then this last piece here where it talks about younger men are the least committed to gender diversity, while younger women are the most committed to gender diversity. So, I think, again, I want to dive back into the report and go a little bit deeper in the data and what wraps around the data, because I think it'll be very helpful when you and I, Lisa, talk to our clients to give them a broader systemic picture of what can work for them and what will not work for them. But I thought it was just a really important read to give some perspective on what you and I see on a regular
Yeah.
basis with organizations.
Yeah, it's a little disappointing, or a lot disappointing, right? That in the 10 years that they've been doing this report, there's been some movement of the needle, but not significantly. And then obviously in 2020, 2021, we know that women, particularly lower income women and women of color, were most impacted by COVID. And there was a mass exodus from the workforce, and a lack of care and concern on the part of employers, kind of all types of professions related to what it meant for kids to be home, for those families that have children, right? And how the burden ended up falling primarily on the women. And the kind of little patience in the workplace when everything went online, for the fact that they were being pulled in these different directions. So I know that things went backwards, right? It was. I know you and I talked about this earlier, before we became unfazed, unedited, when we were still just unfazed, and that the percentage backsliding was extraordinarily high, and like we'd lost 50 years of progress or something. I'm forgetting the number exactly, but it was huge. So that has likely been represented in this 22, 23, and 24 report. But what's interesting to me is that last point that you said around younger men being the least committed to gender diversity, because I think we assume that younger generations, Alpha, Generation Z, are much better at understanding that gender is not a binary, that gender is socially constructed, that wherever you fall in your gender identity, that doesn't predetermine your capabilities. I think that there's that narrative exists. And so then when we look at this, and presumably it's cisgender men, younger men, are less committed to gender diversity, it makes me think of some of the data that's been released this year that is identifying a growing ideological gap between men and women in the 18 to 29-year-old, where women are moving left politically, so becoming more liberal, and men are either staying where they are or they are moving to the right, so they are becoming more conservative. So there's a higher percentage of young men who support Donald Trump than young women. So I wonder how that is correlated or connected to this finding in the report that younger men in the workplace are less committed to gender diversity on the whole, and how that's trending kind of in opposition to this popular narrative about newer generations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking conversely, given life experience, given possibly, having a family, growing a family, etc., if that interrupts the stereotypes of both younger men and older men, whereas we thought younger men would be more open to gender equity and certain aspects around it when they may not be, and older men may be more open to gender equity because they have more salient experiences and they may have more proximity. Because let me tell you something, the way that a young man who doesn't have any responsibilities and may not necessarily have any close women in his life can be very different from someone who's lived a little bit longer, who may have a spouse, depending on the relationship, that they care deeply about. The whole girl dad phenomenon of, how can you love and support your own daughters, but not love and support everybody's daughter? Those are concepts that may fall into that dynamic, but that is important for us to, again, because Lisa, we talk about this all the time in regards to stereotyping, and just prejudice in general, of let's let the data and the information inform what we thought we knew. It's not always going to bolster what we thought, because
Right,
that is
right.
truly out of alignment of what I thought as well, based on
Mm-hmm.
my
Mm-hmm.
experiences. And it has to make us really rethink, how are we going to um, either speak to or maneuver around those perspectives that don't align with our own. I think that's important to think about.
Yeah, I agree. I do really like that point around age and how some both professional and personal experience might be shaping the ways in which you think about gender
Mm-hmm.
equity, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so as younger men gain more experience in their personal lives and as in their professional life, maybe that will shift. I mean, I guess we will have to wait
Mm-hmm.
on that, but that's curious. That's an interesting
Mm-hmm.
perspective to think about, because
Yeah.
usually we think about getting older as becoming more entrenched, right, in an opinion, and less willing to
Mm-hmm.
shift. You know what you know,
Mm-hmm.
you believe what you believe, and it is what it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's really
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they're just, I still do believe that there are some experiences that are life-changing experiences that can be a seismic shift, for people in ways that are unexpected, and some that aren't, right? Like I've seen, for example, lots of people, including men, women, people of all experiences, that had a completely uh, diametric shift when they either lost a family member or gained a family member. Um, if they've witnessed something very specific and it changes their perspective on things. So, we have, Lisa, remember when we were talking about JD Vance and the whole childcare issue where he just thought he came up with this brilliant idea about providing childcare? There are some men that have had a seismic shift in regards to possibly seeing their partner give birth and or having a daughter. Their seismic shift in regards to understanding gender was because of that. Some do not, like JD Vance, and some do. And so, given that, I still hold the door open for some of those experiences because they can uh, move people in ways that were unexpected. I know that a lot of my experiences in regards to parenthood, my perspectives on being a parent, completely different after my kids got here. If you asked me 13 or more years ago, I would have given you probably a very different response to most questions about parenting, parenthood, systems around parenting until I had them. Right. And so, given that, I just wonder if that kind of plays a part in the lived experience of human development because we are different people, before and after certain experiences happen. Just the
Yeah.
reality of things. So, yeah.
Well, we'll include a link to this report so you can check out those findings
Yes.
yourself and some information about that political gender gap too. We'll include that. But let's move on to
Mhm.
phase three. I think Shauna, you saw a little clip
Yeah.
that piqued your interest online.
Well, my first peak at this particular video actually was because it happened to include fourth graders. My youngest is a fifth grader now, but I'm looking at these kids like, oh my word, these kids are speaking 2 to 3 different languages. And I could tell that because they were looking at one language on the computer screen, but they were speaking in another language at that time. So that was really interesting to me and caught my attention. And so when I kept watching, I realized that CNN was sharing this story called Finland is winning the war on fake news. Other nations want the blueprint, right? And so basically, what they're doing, they passed a law that allowed for this anti fake news initiative in 2014. And so K through 12 kids get media literacy lessons. And the whole point of the media literacy lessons is to protect the valuable asset of the truth based on Finland's perspective, right? And we've had countless conversations about what the truth even is on this podcast, right? But what I thought was really interesting is that for us, Lisa, as being academically trained in a certain way to question lots of things, where it comes from, who created it, who funded it. Lisa, if someone were to email us a quote unquote academic or scholarly article right now, some of the first things we would look at is who is the author, what's their background, what institution do they teach at or research for, who funded the study. These are all things that you and I, based on our US uh, advanced educational training, we have learned to look at. And you've also reminded me many times that, of course, not everyone has access to the level of education that we have. And so, what then happens when the person who does not have higher education, right, hears or sees something and they are taking it as truth because they don't know how to critically think or process or question the validity of this information, right? So it kind of reminds me, Lisa, of I showed it to the boys. This has been a couple of years ago. I showed this screenshot of a tweet at the time to the boys, and it was some quote about the quality of information or the quality of whatever. And it was tweeted out by, quote, Abraham Lincoln, right? And so I showed it to the boys to see if they would catch and understand that Abraham Lincoln been gone. He been gone. Okay. There's no way that Abraham Lincoln could have possibly tweeted this, right? But I'm trying to test to see if the boys are going to pick up on this, right? And so fortunately, Trey picked up on it. He's like, wait a minute, mom. Abraham Lincoln didn't have the internet. Way to go, son. We'll figure out the rest, right? But to be clear, there's lots of adults who aren't thinking that critically. And if it's coming from a media outlet that they respect for whatever reasons, they are not going to question things. And so for me, I'm thinking to myself, this gets scary. And the fact that an entire country even needs this as an initiative is scary to me, Lisa. So given that, I'll stop there. Finland has its own history and story as to why they need this,
Right.
but I think given that other nations are wanting the blueprint of this curriculum, obviously there's global concern. Yeah.
It's interesting to me this is from 2014, right? Because I feel like fake news didn't really take off at least in the US. I mean, it didn't really snowball until more recently, but Finland was already attempting to create media literacy in their young people before that. And I really agree. There's a lot of nonprofit organizations in the United States that are about media literacy and how do you critically understand the media. I mean, given our first phase, right, where we were talking about the ways in which headlines can be deceiving and not really sharing the whole truth of a situation. I think this is brilliant and doesn't surprise me at all that Finland would do this. I just feel like many countries in Europe, not all, but many are so far ahead when it comes to the education that they provide their young people and the value they place on that in terms of public education. I mean, you think about the United States, books are getting banned. I went down I think I looked at the comments for this clip maybe, and I went down a rabbit hole, which is never a good idea. But there are people saying, well, the books aren't being banned. They're just being repositioned to the correct age group, which is that's also not true, right? Like some books are being completely removed from the shelves and from curricula, and no child of any age has access to them. So again, like how we're framing it, it makes me think, Shauna, of the book that I told you about, Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized, that he published in 2020. And he talks about the ways in which we seek out information that affirms our identity. And because our political party identification has become so central to who we are as humans, then we tend to only look at and understand and believe information that supports that. And I forget the exact statistic, but it's something like 40% of Republicans use Fox News as their primary source of news. But for Democrats, it's much more diverse. Like the numbers were split 20%, 18%, 8%, like across a whole different variety of news sources, which I thought was really interesting. But to your point about people who haven't had the opportunity to be educated in a formal way, what he argues in his book and what the psychological research shows is that it doesn't matter how book smart you are, whether formally or informally, right? Like your capacity to believe something as true is shaped by that political and ideological identification over and above your capacity for critical thinking and IQ and intelligence. So I'm curious about these kids in Finland, whether this is a US phenomenon or whether globally, even with this media literacy training they're getting to identify fake news as children, will at some point their ideological or political identification becomes so strong that what they learned around critical consumption of the media will that become secondary, right?
Well, and okay, let's go to another place with this too that connects this larger chain. Going back to what we were mentioning before about whether it's sane washing or whatever we want to call it, and um, Lisa and I attempting to chip away at holding media and journalism accountable in this country. I think the mere notion of even having media literacy lessons comes out the gate holding Finland and other forms of communication accountable for saying our kids are growing up to be uh, critical thinkers as adults. So you don't even have the wiggle room to try it. Whereas other countries like the US, we don't know that Abraham
Yeah,
Lincoln didn't
yeah,
send that tweet.
right.
And so they can get by with more here because we're not ready to accept thought patterns different from our own in a, in connection to the political party. And on top of that, we're not trained. So going back to your great point of training doesn't matter. And on top of that, well, not saying that it doesn't matter, but training doesn't matter as much as political identity. Well, when you may have less of both or more of both, that then determines how media will respond.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a really great point.
I'm not going to be able to be that journalist that gets away with proverbial murder on paper because my readers are
Yeah.
highly aware of what's not
Yes.
going to be true. So I'm not even going to try it.
Yeah, so you know from the get go that
Yeah.
your readership has
Mm-hmm.
a different capacity to understand when they're
Mm-hmm.
being bullshit, when bullshit is being put out, right?
That's
Because of
right.
that, they're
That's right.
learning that in third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, right?
That's right.
That's a really great point. So it shifts the whole culture around what is permissible. I love
That's
that.
right. That's
Yeah, I
right.
love
Yeah,
that.
it's you're not going to get away with that because the entire country now knows. And then I even went back to um, a couple of things I use all the time in regards to this promoting critical thinking. Well, what does critical thinking really mean, right? We're not talking about necessarily intelligence or not. We're talking about the capacity to make decisions based off of information, solving a problem, even actually conducting research to look at various points. So the Finland curriculum specifically speaks to if Shauna and Lisa are fourth graders that read this article from CNN, we are learning to also look to see if it's also in several other media outlets to determine its validity, right? So researching that, not scholarly research, but doing a little bit of homework, right? Creatively putting things together and then also being curious enough because one of the things I think is really interesting is that oftentimes critical thinking shuts down because we're not curious enough to think beyond what's presented to us, right? So if what's presented to us is 2 plus 2 is the only way to get to 4, well, if Shauna and Lisa, the fourth graders, are curious enough, we can say, well, wait a minute. 2 plus 2 isn't the only way to get to 4. We could do 2 times 2. We could do 1 plus 3. We could do 3 plus 1. We could do half plus 3.5. So, given that, if you stop the curiosity and it's just believed without even a intellectual banter of curiosity, then you're going to stop right there anyway. Which goes back to what I've said before is lazy
Yeah,
thinking.
yeah,
That's just my
yeah.
shortcut way of saying it is a shorter, quicker way to think without really processing. And so, yeah, I think to your point, Lisa, around the book by Ezra Klein, shoot, I think just the existence of such media will begin to hold media accountable
Yeah.
through these lessons. So I love that piece of it. It's having a, I don't know if that was an intended outcome or not, but it may be a really great unintended outcome
Mm-hmm.
uh given where Finland's trying to go. And plus two, we got to remember our old school geography, y'all. Finland and Russia share a boundary. And so given that all of this was going on before Russia meddled with our elections. All of these things were going on. They were trying to push this initiative forward before that happened. And so I don't know if that just happened to be very lucky timing in regards to figuring out what's true and what's not. But if you have residents of Finland, of course, students, other journalists, and politicians being able to use this approach to journalism, that changes the entire landscape of what's
Mm-hmm.
communicated, what's not, and propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, being that close to Russia, certainly. But I feel like, I mean, I just feel very scared about the state of education in this country and the ways in which states are moving in direction that restricts oversight of what is being taught to children and the ways in which that might contribute to further polarization and a lower development around these critical thinking skills, problem solving, those kinds of things, if you are allowing kiddos to be taught in a way that is important to the family, but perhaps doesn't give them life skills, right? And,
Yeah. Yeah.
with our lack of rules around lying, right? Politicians I could just put out a lie about you, Shauna, and there's no law about that outside of you suing me for slander, libel, defamation, right? But there's nothing prohibiting me as a political candidate to say Shauna hates puppies and wants to ban pizza, right? I mean, like, there's,
Right.
I imagine you can't do that in other countries.
Right. Right.
But
hmm Or at
starting
least
from a
it's
different
not as
place,
easy.
yeah, yeah,
It's not, at
yeah,
least it's not as easy as it is to do here.
right,
It's very easy
right.
to do here. So, all for freedom of speech. We didn't say freedom of true speech. We just said freedom
We
of
said freedom of
speech.
speech. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, that is probably a discussion for another time. Whose speech,
Yeah.
what is free, and how do those two interact with each other? So let's wrap it up here.
Yeah.
Shauna, so how can folks get a hold of us between episodes?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, while you're over there trying to figure out the truth, and so are we, please take a look at, of course, all of our YouTube episodes. You can find us there at Unfazed Unedited with brackets around the first un. You can find us at Apple Podcasts and Spotify to share with anyone that's in your circle. Instagram, we're there at Unfazed Pod. LinkedIn at Unfazed Pod as well. Also, you can email us your questions and we'll be more than happy to answer them at info@unfazedpodcast.com. And of course, our website where you can find all the things, unfazedpodcast.com. So if you like this week's episode, please share it with folks, leave a review, send it to your friends, your coworkers, or anyone else in this phase of your life. So, Dr. Lisa, we'll hold on to the truth until next week, right?
Yes, we will. I'll see you next week.